It was the night of March 9th, 1945, and while most of Japan slept, an invisible threat soared across the Pacific skies. Unlike previous missions targeting industrial zones, this time the objective was Tokyo itself. Not its factories, but its homes, its people, its heart. Deep inside the bellies of over 300 B-29 Superfortress bombers, a deadly cargo of M-69 incendiary bomblets lay waiting to be unleashed. Pilots had been briefed. Low altitude, no formation flying, total destruction. Major General Curtis LeMay had redefined the rules of engagement. Altitude restrictions were removed to increase bomb accuracy. Machine guns were stripped from some B-29s to reduce weight and make room for more bombs. This wasn't about precision anymore. It was about area bombing, about making fire itself the weapon. The planes flew at just 5,000 to 9,000 feet, low enough to feel the heat of their own chaos. Below, Tokyo's wards were made of wood and paper, a city waiting to burn. Dense neighborhoods, narrow alleys, and weathered homes created the perfect conditions for a firestorm. LeMay knew it, and he knew the psychological effect would be just as brutal as the physical devastation. This mission, later known as Operation Meetinghouse, was meant to break morale, not just military capability. The B-29s reached Japan's airspace without detection. Japan's once formidable air defenses had been depleted after years of war. Radar operators failed to mount a coordinated response, and the bombers moved undisturbed over the city. Sirens wailed, too late. By the time many residents awoke, it was already raining fire. The first wave of B-29s dropped incendiaries in a crisscross pattern, creating a flaming X on the city grid, a carefully designed fire trap. Subsequent waves intensified the blaze. The M-69s exploded mid-air, each scattering a sticky, napalm-like substance that clung to rooftops and skin. Flames leapt from house to house, leapt from person to person. In minutes, entire blocks were consumed. Witnesses later recalled a wall of fire rushing faster than a man could run. The air turned to poison, superheated, ash-choked, and unbreathable. Children burned in their sleep. Elders fell trying to escape. Even the canals, often used as escape routes, turned into traps as people dove into boiling water. No distinction was made between soldier or civilian, old or young, guilty or innocent. By the time dawn broke, Tokyo had been transformed into a landscape of smoldering ruins. Over 100,000 people were dead, and 1 million were left homeless. It was, and remains, the deadliest air raid in history, more devastating than even Hiroshima or Nagasaki. The mission was considered a success by U.S. command. The numbers, bombs dropped, casualties inflicted, were recorded with mechanical precision. But the moral line had shifted. Fire had become strategy. Terror had become a tool. As the last B-29 turned for Guam, its crew saw Tokyo's red glow still burning in the distance. For the survivors below, the city was no longer home. It was a graveyard without graves. It was past midnight on August 5, 1945, when the silent Sitinian island was broken only by the faint hum of distant generators and the disciplined footsteps of aircrew. Under the veil of darkness, final mission briefings were held in tight, windowless rooms. The selected men weren't ordinary. They were about to take part in a mission that would mark one of the most consequential nights in modern history. Their target, Hiroshima. The lead bomber was no regular aircraft. It was a B-29 Superfortress christened Enola Gay, named by pilot Paul Tibbets after his mother. This wasn't its first mission, but it was the one that would etch its name into history. Tibbets, a calm yet firm leader, had practiced this scenario countless times, but tonight he wasn't dropping conventional bombs. The payload was Little Boy, the world's first operational atomic bomb. As technicians carefully loaded the 10-foot-long device into the bomb bay, tension gripped the crew like a vice. The bomb wasn't just powerful, it was experimental, and nobody could fully predict what would happen once it detonated. Security was so tight that even most of the crew didn't know the full extent of the weapon's capability. They were simply told, drop it, escape fast, and pray. At around 2:45 a.m., final systems checks were completed. The aircraft's 4 massive Wright 3350 engines roared to life, sending vibrations through the steel runway. The Enola Gay taxied slowly, joined by 2 other observation aircraft, the Great Artiste and Necessary Evil. Only a handful of people on Earth knew that the world was about to change forever. By 3 a.m., the bomber began its takeoff roll. The sight was surreal. A sleek silver aircraft illuminated by sparse runway lights lifting into the black Pacific sky. Its wings sliced the humid air as it banked northeast toward Japan. Inside, the atmosphere was clinical but tense. Navigators traced invisible lines across their charts. The bombardier, Major Thomas Farabee, stared ahead, rehearsing the precise moment he would release a bomb unlike any ever used. Japan, meanwhile, slept unaware. Hiroshima was considered a virgin target, untouched by previous firebombing raids. This wasn't by accident. The U.S. had deliberately preserved certain cities to fully measure the effects of the atomic bomb. Hiroshima's military value and geography made it a perfect test site. Nestled between mountains and densely populated, it would amplify the bomb's shockwaves. As the Enola Gay approached its destination, it ascended to 31,000 feet. The Japanese radar systems were not alarmed. They'd become used to small American reconnaissance flights, and a lone B-29 didn't trigger mass evacuations. It was this calm, this complete lack of expectation, that would seal the city's fate. At 8:15 a.m. Hiroshima time, Major Farabee gave the command. Little Boy was released, beginning its 43-second descent. The crew wore heavy goggles to shield their eyes from the flash. Then it happened. A light brighter than 1,000 suns erupted below. The shockwave hit the Enola Gay even at its altitude, jarring the aircraft. The men looked back, and what they saw was beyond comprehension. A massive mushroom cloud rising with a fiery core, consuming everything in its path. Below them, a city was vanishing. People were incinerated instantly. Buildings turned to dust. The firestorm that followed pulled oxygen from the air, creating winds strong enough to uproot trees and tear flesh from bone. Over 70,000 died within seconds. Another 70,000 would succumb to injuries in the months to follow. The crew said nothing for a long while, only silence, broken by the hum of engines and the flickering disbelief in their eyes. By the evening of March 9, 1945, the American B-29 bombers had already begun assembling in the skies over the Mariana Islands. Unlike previous missions that targeted military facilities, this operation would focus on the densely populated heart of Tokyo. The bombers were stripped of most defensive armament to carry more M69 incendiary bombs, designed specifically to ignite Japan's paper and wood homes. At 5,000 to 7,000 feet, they flew low to increase accuracy. The first waves dropped napalm-filled clusters, lighting fires block by block. The strategy was cruelly effective. Once a section caught fire, the wooden houses acted as fuel. The narrow streets turned into tunnels of flame, cutting off escape routes for thousands. Eyewitnesses described the sound of boiling tar, the sky turning orange, and oxygen being sucked from the air. The firestorm became so intense that people were literally incinerated while running. Those who sought shelter in canals or rivers were boiled alive by the superheated water. Many clung to hope in shallow ditches, only to be overtaken by the fast-moving inferno. The firestorms generated winds strong enough to rip clothing off bodies. Entire neighborhoods were consumed in minutes. According to survivors, even the asphalt streets began to melt. It was not just a bombing, it was environmental annihilation. Civilians were the primary victims, with over 100,000 deaths in a single night, most of them burned or suffocated. The scale of the destruction was so massive that American pilots, despite being trained for war, reported vomiting upon returning to base after seeing the inferno from above. Tokyo had become a smoldering graveyard, and the Japanese government could barely respond. Firefighting efforts were overwhelmed within the first hour. What made this night particularly horrific was not just the number of deaths, but the manner of death. Traditional shelters and bunkers failed. The temperature reached up to 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, or 980 degrees Celsius, making most protective efforts futile. Survivors spoke of seeing charred bodies fused together, mothers holding children, entire families caught mid-flight. Despite the devastation, Japanese radio remained silent for hours, unsure of how to communicate the scale of the disaster. It wasn't just a military loss, it was a psychological rupture. For the first time, ordinary citizens realized they were no longer protected by the home island's distance. The war had reached their front steps. Meanwhile, American strategists viewed the operation as a success. They noted that a handful of B-29s with incendiaries had inflicted more structural and human damage than dozens of high-altitude raids with traditional explosives. It reshaped their tactics moving forward. If one night of fire could do this to Tokyo, what would happen to other cities? In a single night, the city's eastern districts, Sumida, Koto, and Taito, were reduced to ashes. Hospitals, schools, and shrines, nothing was spared. Yet what haunted the world later was the silence that followed. No sirens, no screams, just smoke and the crackle of embers. Tokyo had become a tomb with no names. The morning after the bombing of Tokyo, silence blanketed the city, not just because of the destruction, but because there was nothing left to say. Survivors wandered aimlessly through a landscape of soot and bone, some still clutching remnants of family photographs, others calling names into the smoke with no replies. The Imperial Japanese Army, long confident that America wouldn't dare strike civilian centers with such brutality, found its assumptions shattered. The Tokyo Metropolitan Police Headquarters had been obliterated. Even the Ministry of Home Affairs faced communications breakdowns, with their field operatives lost in the flames. High-ranking officials met that morning with burns on their uniforms and tears in their eyes. For the first time, Emperor Hirohito was briefed personally on a civilian death toll exceeding 100,000. His silence, some say, was longer than the report itself. While official radio remained cautious in tone, secret military cables admitted the truth. We have lost a part of Tokyo completely.
In military circles, the raid was nicknamed the Night of Black Snow, a haunting reference to the ash that rained down for hours after the attack. Thousands of burned-out survivors had retreated to nearby regions, and hospitals were overwhelmed. Makeshift morgues were set up in schoolyards, and the government issued mass cremation orders by sundown. The psychological effect was immediate. Schoolchildren in Osaka and Nagoya began to be evacuated, not to avoid battle, but to escape incineration. Urban evacuation drills turned into full-scale countryside resettlement programs. Japan's confidence in its invincible homeland had been forever pierced. Meanwhile, the American Strategic Bombing Survey, or SBS, reported record-breaking success. One night, fewer than 300 bombers, and yet more death and structural damage than the entire Battle of Britain. The Japanese Defense Ministries knew they could not stop another strike of that magnitude. The anti-air defenses had failed. Radar coverage was thin, fighter response was delayed, and the fire spread too quickly. Civilians began to question the government's narrative. If the military couldn't protect Tokyo, what could they protect? Propaganda posters that once proclaimed the glorious shield of the empire now hung torn, half-burned on the walls of collapsed homes. Faith in Japan's war machine began to rot from within. In the United States, news of the raid received mixed responses. Headlines praised military precision, but photos published weeks later shocked many. Church leaders and pacifist groups criticized the targeting of civilians. The question arose, was this still war or retribution? President Roosevelt, informed privately, offered no public statement, only ordering more raids. Inside Japan, the people began to speak in whispers. If Tokyo could fall, what of Osaka, Nagoya, or even Kyoko? Rumors swirled about America's next move. The fear was no longer of death, but of annihilation without warning. The ground was no longer sacred, and the fire had only just begun.
The moment the incendiaries made contact with the wooden structures of the city, an inferno was born. Flames raced through narrow alleys and over rooftops like liquid fury. The firestorms created their own weather systems, violent updrafts pulling oxygen from the very lungs of those trying to flee. Survivors spoke of how the air itself seemed to ignite, how walls of flame moved with intention, as if guided by vengeance rather than physics. The B-29 crews could see it all from above. Looking down, some described the city glowing like a furnace, the streets disappearing beneath rolling clouds of smoke and dancing light. Others turned away, disturbed by the realization that below them were civilians, not military targets. The mission had been labeled as strategic, but the devastation felt anything but surgical. Within 30 minutes, entire neighborhoods were erased. Schools, temples, homes, none were spared. The fire consumed everything indiscriminately. Fire brigades, overwhelmed and under-equipped, could only watch as water evaporated before it touched the flames. The screams became part of the wind. It was no longer a city, it was a cauldron. People fled in every direction, many heading toward rivers and canals, hoping the water would offer safety. But even there, the flames found them. The firestorms created vacuum effects, pulling in oxygen so fiercely that even those submerged found it hard to breathe. Survivors later recalled how the river itself seemed to boil in places, littered with floating bodies and ash. Some families tied themselves together with ropes, hoping to stay united in the chaos. Others ran barefoot through molten streets, the soles of their feet melting onto the ground. The searing heat ignited fabric, hair, even shadows. There was no time to think.
only to run or collapse. Some tried to dig shelters in the earth with their bare hands. Many didn't make it far enough. Meanwhile, Japanese civil defense efforts were paralyzed. The magnitude of the attack had surpassed any drills or predictions. Air raid sirens had wailed far too late. Bomb shelters collapsed or filled with toxic fumes. Communications lines were cut early on, rendering central coordination impossible. Panic reigned supreme. It was every person for themselves. Amid the chaos, one could still see flashes of humanity. A mother shielding her children beneath her body. A teenage boy dragging the elderly through smoke-filled corridors. A Buddhist monk ringing the temple bell one last time before it too fell silent. These were fragments of resistance, not against America, but against despair. For the American commanders, the operation was deemed a success. Over 100,000 people had died, the majority of them civilians. Tokyo was effectively flattened in key areas, and Japanese morale had taken a devastating blow. But among the crew members, the victory felt hollow. Some later admitted to feeling haunted by what they had done, realizing they had unleashed hell on a city while sitting in an air-conditioned cabin. The scale of destruction triggered both awe and unease among American officials. If a single bombing raid could erase an entire city, what would the use of an atomic bomb mean for the world? The lines between tactical victory and moral ambiguity blurred. Yet the operation continued to be marked as one of the most efficient bombing raids in military history. That night, Tokyo became more than a city on fire. It became a symbol of war's evolution, of the unbearable price of surrender, and of a line that once crossed would reshape warfare forever. In a single night, the world had witnessed not just destruction, but transformation. Nothing about warfare would remain the same after Tokyo. As dawn began to break over Tokyo, the sun illuminated a city unrecognizable. What had once been the bustling heart of Japan now lay in ruins, its buildings skeletal, its streets carpeted in soot and debris. Survivors wandered the destruction in silence, faces blank with shock. Some searched for loved ones, others sat motionless, too numb to cry. The Japanese government scrambled to assess the damage. Radio communications restored at daybreak carried nothing but static and fragments of chaos. Emperor Hirohito, typically shielded from direct details of military devastation, was informed that a third of Tokyo had been consumed in one night. The psychological blow struck deeper than any military loss to date. Hospitals were overflowing. Makeshift triage zones appeared in parks and shrines. Burn wounds, smoke inhalation, and collapse injuries overwhelmed even the most prepared doctors. Supplies ran out within hours. Volunteers tore curtains from temples to use as bandages. Children carried water in metal helmets for burn victims. But even in survival, the city had been transformed into something out of a nightmare. The Japanese press, strictly censored, struggled to balance morale with reality. Official headlines downplayed the scale, but whispers traveled faster than ink. Survivors' stories spread through neighborhoods untouched by fire, and a new kind of fear set in, not just of death, but of complete erasure. The American military, meanwhile, began preparing for the next raid. The success of Operation Meetinghouse encouraged similar tactics. If one raid could break a city, then perhaps repetition could break a nation. Targets were selected, maps marked, fuel loaded. While Tokyo smoldered, strategy turned cold once again. Back in the U.S., newspapers reported the bombing as a massive tactical victory. Photos showed B-29 crews smiling, waving, medals on their chests. There was little mention of the human cost. Words like precision, surgical, and strategic whitewashed the image of 100,000 civilians dead in hours. It was a different kind of war now, one measured in tonnage, not tears. Some American commanders did feel the weight of what had occurred. In private memos, doubts were raised. If this was what conventional firebombing could do, what would the atomic bomb, then still a secret, bring? Was there a line they had already crossed, or was the real line still ahead? In Japan, military leaders faced a growing internal conflict. They had promised to protect the homeland, yet their capital had burned. Trust in leadership began to erode. Civilians questioned the propaganda they had been fed for years. Could their empire truly survive this new kind of warfare? Or was surrender, once unthinkable, now a creeping possibility? Children wandered through the ruins holding charred toys. Mothers used tatami mats as burial shrouds. The smell of ash and scorched flesh lingered in the air. Tokyo had become a graveyard with street names. And yet, among the despair, there were signs of quiet resilience. An old man sweeping rubble, a woman praying at a blackened shrine, a teacher gathering surviving children for a lesson amid the ruins. This was no longer just about war. It was about identity, survival, and the soul of a nation brought to its knees, not by soldiers on the ground, but by steel birds in the sky. The future of Japan was now a question mark written in smoke.
In the days that followed the Tokyo raid, the air over Japan grew heavier, both with smoke and dread. Citizens in Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, and Yokohama looked to the skies differently now. A clear sky no longer meant peace, it meant exposure. People began sleeping in trenches, clutching wet towels and gas masks, whispering silent prayers to ancestors. Intelligence reports inside the Japanese High Command warned that the U.S. would continue these tactics. There was no comfort in delay. The loss of Tokyo was not just a military failure, it was a symbolic collapse. The heart of the empire had been pierced, and the scar was too large to hide. American General Curtis LeMay, architect of the raid, reviewed post-strike photographs with satisfaction. He believed that destroying Japan's war infrastructure meant destroying its cities, and that meant destroying its people. When asked if the morality of such actions troubled him, he replied bluntly, "If we lose, we'll be tried as war criminals." That cold calculation became doctrine. Meanwhile, Emperor Hirohito was seen publicly for the first time in months, visiting survivors. He said nothing. His face told the story. People bowed as he passed, but their eyes held questions. Could even a divine figure protect them from fire that fell from the stars? Among the ashes of Tokyo, life clawed its way back. Farmers came into the city with carts of food, refusing payment. Priests performed cremations from dawn to dusk. Entire families moved into subway tunnels, stringing makeshift curtains for privacy. The city refused to die, even if it no longer resembled itself. Far away, in the Nevada desert, American scientists tested devices even more powerful than firebombs. The atomic bomb was nearing completion. Some strategists whispered that Tokyo had been a dress rehearsal.
proof that civilian targets could break morale faster than invading troops ever could. The world stood on the edge of something unthinkable. But for many Japanese citizens, the bombing had already changed everything. People stopped speaking of victory. The question was no longer if they could win, but how long they could endure. Children were no longer taught battle songs, but instructed on how to dig fire trenches and wet blankets. War had become not a duty, but a daily survival ritual. Letters written by survivors painted a haunting picture. "The sky screamed," wrote one woman. "The night turned white," wrote another. A teenage boy who lost his parents simply wrote, "We burned and nobody came." These testimonies, decades later, became the emotional archive of the raid, more lasting than ruins, more honest than government records. Tokyo never fully recovered its pre-war soul. The city was rebuilt, taller and more modern. But those who lived through that night always remembered the sound of sirens, the wind before the flames, the shadows dancing on walls. They carried those memories in their bones. The firebombing of Tokyo didn't end the war, but it shifted its shape. It told the world that cities could be erased without nuclear weapons. It showed that warfare had entered a new age, not of heroes and flags, but of logistics and annihilation. And in the scorched soil of Tokyo, the seeds of surrender had been sown.